Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. Welcome to the second episode of my series on the books that have been important to me over the years, the books that I've sometimes visited time and time again. My first chapter was on Riders in the Chariot by Patrick White, an Australian author. And today I'm looking at Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. I don't think I need to say much about D.H. Lawrence, do I? If I do, you're probably watching the wrong channel. He was born in 1885 and died in 1930 of tuberculosis. His health was pretty poor throughout most of his life. He was a very prolific writer. He wrote lots of novels, the most famous of which are probably Sons and Lovers, which I'm talking about today. Also, Women in Love, and probably Lady Chatterley's Lover is his best known work, largely because it was so controversial at the time. But he wrote hundreds of short stories, essays, a lot of travel writing. He wrote poetry. He's probably rightly regarded as one of the greatest English writers, anyway, of the 20th century. Because of his health, he actually left England at a reasonably young age, in his mid-20s. He spent time in Europe. He visited Australia and wrote the novel Kangaroo, based on his experiences here. He also visited the southern United States and Mexico, and out of that experience came his novel The Plumed Serpent. He died in the south of France in 1930. My first contact with Lawrence was actually in the middle of my high school years, during an art class of all things. We were given an extract from a novel which contained a very graphic account of a bullfight, and we were asked to paint an image based on that. It was only much later, when I was reading The Plumed Serpent, that I realised the extract actually came from that novel. I first read Sons and Lovers probably in year 11 or 12 at high school, I'm not sure which. I would have been, I guess, around 16 or 17 years old at the time. It appealed to me because it was about a young boy becoming a man and learning about the world, discovering sex. He was a working class man, so I kind of identified with that. He was going through all the experiences that a 17-year-old boy goes through. I was also beginning to explore those deeper questions about spirituality and mysticism. Oh, and the novel was also considered to be just a little bit naughty. It was banned initially in the United States, but it's really very, very tame, even compared to Lawrence's later book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. It was Lawrence's third novel, following The White Peacock and The Trespasser, the latter having, as far as I can tell, vanished pretty much without a trace. Sons and Lovers was published in 1913 and probably written between, say, 1911 through to 1913. It's considered by some people to be an early masterpiece, and it's certainly been the one book by Lawrence that I've returned to several times over the years. Others at the time and since have regarded it as a deeply flawed novel, although somehow still compelling. Lawrence certainly makes many of the basic mistakes that a novice writer will make, that they'll be warned about these days in any writing course or in any writing group. I'm not going into all that here, and I'm not going to be offering a critique of the book. As I indicated in my introductory video about this series, these are not book reviews or even really in-depth critiques, although there will be some elements of that, most certainly. But mostly, I'm concerned with what the book has meant to me over the years, and this is very much a personal reaction. Lawrence himself certainly regarded the book very highly. In one of his letters to his editor at the time, he writes, "It's a great tragedy, and I tell you, I have written a great book. It's the tragedy of thousands of young men in England. Read my novel. It's a great novel." With the usual touch of modesty from Lawrence there. The claim that it's the tragedy of thousands of young men in England, I'll return to that later. One other thing that wasn't is central to the appeal of the novel for me was the relationship between the main character, Paul Morrell, and his mother. Although I certainly didn't have the kind of relationship with my mother that Lawrence describes here, I do understand how a mother can become the dominating factor in the life of a child and a teenager. An overbearing mother, that I could relate to. It was very interesting when I came to read this book again at this time in my life, having since spent many years working as an editor. I can see how badly written it is in many respects, but still, it has that appeal. Just very quickly, I want to summarize the plot. The novel tells the story of Paul Morrell, the second son and third child of Walter and Gertrude Morrell. Walter is a coal miner from the Newcastle region of England. He marries Gertrude Coppard, who's from a somewhat higher station of society, so she marries downhill somewhat. And they go to live in a small mining village where life's pretty tough, there's not much money. Walter is a heavy drinker, as most of the miners are, and the gloss very quickly falls away from this relationship as far as Gertrude is concerned. She becomes very bitter and jaded, and she turns her love away from Walter towards the children. Though the other children come into the story, the novel mainly relates the story of Paul's relationship to his mother and the two lovers in his life at that time, Miriam and Clara. This is how Lawrence summarizes the plot of the novel in a letter to his editor, Edward Garnett. Now, bear with me as I read this to you. It follows this idea. A woman of character and refinement goes into the lower class and has no satisfaction in her own life. She has had a passion for her husband, so the children are born of passion and have heaps of vitality. But as her sons grow up, she selects them as lovers, first the eldest, then the second. These sons are urged into life by their reciprocal love of their mother, urged on and on. But when they come to manhood, they can't love because their mother is the strongest power in their lives and holds them. It's rather like Goethe and his mother and Frau von Stein and Christiana. As soon as the young men come into contact with women, there's a split. William gives his sex to a fribble, and his mother holds his soul. But the split kills him because he doesn't know where he is. The next son gets a woman who fights for his soul, fights his mother. The son loves the mother. All the sons hate and are jealous of the father. The battle goes on between the mother and the girl, with the son as object. The mother gradually proves stronger because of the tie of blood. The son decides to leave his soul in his mother's hands and, like his elder brother, go for passion. He gets passion, then the split begins to tell again. But almost unconsciously, the mother realizes what is the matter and begins to die. The son casts off his mistress, tends to his mother dying. He is left in the end naked of everything, with the drift towards death. This is not a novel in which the plot details are particularly important. It's these relationships that matter and the psychological processes that are taking place. Lawrence spends a lot of time in the head of Paul Morrell, but also the young women, particularly Miriam. This time, as I was reading the novel, two main questions jumped out at me. The first was, did Lawrence himself realize just how toxic the relationship was between Paul Morrell and his mother? I suppose I should have mentioned that the novel is largely autobiographical, of course. The relationship he's describing here is essentially that between Lawrence and his own mother. And there's not much disguising that fact. The second question was, what did Jesse Chambers think of the book? Jesse is the real-life person on whom the character of Miriam is based. Again, with little attempt to disguise the fact. Something else, most importantly, that I want to consider here is the attitude towards women that's depicted in the novel. Let's begin, though, with this relationship between Paul Morrell and his mother. As is clear from the letter I quoted earlier, Lawrence is obviously aware that the mother, as he says, is the strongest power in their lives. And also that this makes loving other women very difficult for the young men. Both Paul and his older brother William experience this difficulty. But it's more chronic for Paul because he survives. William doesn't. But although Lawrence acknowledges this, I don't think that he recognizes that there is something malicious in the mother, that this is not just normal. In fact, I think he tries to normalize it when he also writes in that same letter, "It's the tragedy of thousands of young men in England." No, Bert, no. Bert is the name that his friends and family used for him. He's David Herbert Lawrence. It isn't normal. This is a very sick, abnormal relationship. The mother is a destructive, toxic force in the life of her sons. The novel attempts to paint the father, Walter, as the villain. And sure, he is an alcoholic with a sometimes violent temper. But it's the mother who causes the real harm here. To be fair to Lawrence, he does introduce some mitigating qualities into the character of the father. The father comes to life when he's tinkering with something or when he's telling a story. We see him struggling to reach the children and express his love for them. Lawrence writes, "His nature was purely sensuous, and she, the wife, strove to make him moral." And again, conversation was impossible between the father and any other member of the family. He was an outsider. He had denied the God in him. And when he does try to communicate, when he tries to express his feelings, this is usually dismissed contemptuously by the rest of the family. The father is viewed at best with a modicum of sympathy, at worst with contempt. The mother, though, not a harsh word is said against the mother, not a word of criticism. She is depicted as a long-suffering martyr. And the damage she does to the boys, particularly William and Paul, is scarcely acknowledged. This is mother's love, according to Lawrence, which he seems to acknowledge as the only true and pure form of love. She constantly pits herself in a battle against the other women in the lives of her sons, a battle for their souls. She accuses Miriam, in front of Paul, but not in front of Miriam herself, of trying to suck Paul's soul out. Lawrence writes, "She could feel Paul being drawn away by this girl, and she did not care for Miriam. She is one of those who will want to suck a man's soul out till he has none of his own left," she said to herself. "And he is just such a gaby," I don't know what that is, "and he is just such a gaby as to let himself be absorbed. She will never let him become a man. She never will." The irony here is mind-boggling, because that is precisely what the mother would do to Paul, absorb his soul, prevent him from becoming a man. But I don't think Lawrence is aware of the irony at all. The mother is faultless. Her sons belong to her. She lives her life through them. Of her two eldest sons, she thinks once they've been placed in employment, she could think of two places, great centres of industry, and feel that she had put a man into each of them, that these men would work out what she wanted. They were derived from her, and their works would also be hers. Here are just a few other quotes from the book to illustrate just how sick this relationship is between Paul and his mother. First of all, Lawrence uses religious imagery to describe this relationship. "A few shocks of corn in the corner of the fallow stood up as if alive. She imagined them bowing. Perhaps her son would be a Joseph." This is a reference to the story from Genesis. Joseph had two dreams in which he envisaged his brother's sheaves of grain bowing down to his own sheaves of grain, and then the sun, moon, and stars bow down to him as well. A little later, while she's holding the baby, the mother says, "My lamb," she cried softly. And at that moment she felt, in some far inner place of her soul, that she and her husband were guilty. This may seem commonplace enough, referring to a child as a lamb, but given the conjunction with the idea of guilt, I can't help thinking that she is imagining her baby here to be the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, or at least their sin, their guilt. Then there's a scene where her husband throws a drawer at her and it hits her on the forehead and cuts her forehead. As she glanced down at the child, her brain reeling, some drops of blood soaked into its white shawl. And then we see this through the husband's eyes. He was turning drearily away when he saw a drop of blood fall from the averted wound into the baby's fragile, glistening hair. Fascinated, he watched the heavy dark drop hang in the glistening cloud and pull down the gossamer. Another drop fell. It would soak through to the baby's scalp. Is this depicting anything other than Paul's baptism by the very blood of his mother? When Paul is a young boy, his mother asks him what he wants to be. His ambition, as far as this world's gear went, was quietly to earn his 30 or 34 shillings a week somewhere near home, and then, when his father died, have a cottage with his mother, paint and go out as he liked, and live happily ever after. Normal enough, perhaps, for a young boy to feel this way about his mother, but Oedipus much? Replacing the father at the mother's side. But if this may pass for normal, there's another scene when Paul is a teenager and he's about to start work. He and his mother go together to Nottingham in preparation for his job interview there. She was gay like a sweetheart. As he saw her hands in their old black kid gloves getting the silver out of the worn purse, his heart contracted with pain of love for her. The mother and son walked down Station Street, feeling the excitement of lovers having an adventure together. Then Lawrence describes what would happen when he returned home from work of an evening. His life story, like an Arabian Nights, was told night after night to his mother. It was almost as if it were her own life. The two shared lives, writes Lawrence. On the whole, he stuck to her as if he were her man, he says again later. Just one more. I could go on and on with this. Yes, I know it well, says the mother. I am old, and therefore I may stand aside. I have nothing more to do with you. You only want me to wait on you. The rest is for Miriam. He could not bear it. Instinctively he realized that he was life to her, and, after all, she was the chief thing to him, the only supreme thing. Is this an almost possessive bond, as I've seen some commentators say? Is this the tragedy of thousands of young men in England, as Lawrence himself says in his letter? But this is just fiction, right? This is about Paul Morrell and his mother, not about Lawrence and his mother, right? Jessie Chambers is the model for the character of Miriam in the novel. And maybe Jessie is not a reliable witness, but is Lawrence? But in her book, D.H. Lawrence, A Personal Record, which she published after Lawrence's death, she records this conversation with Lawrence. You know, I've always loved Mother, he said in a strangled voice. I know you have, I replied. I don't mean that, he replied quickly. I've loved her, like a lover. That's why I could never love you. I can't say, of course, whether this conversation actually took place, but Jessie certainly bears abundant witness to this relationship between Lawrence and his mother. And the death of his mother doesn't seem to free him from this bond. If anything, it made it stronger, because now she could be even further idealized in his imagination, in his memory. Nothing in reality could now challenge this image. She was forever beyond criticism. As Jessie Chambers writes, instead of a release and deliverance from bondage, the bondage was glorified and made absolute. And again, he had to present a distorted picture of our association so that the martyr's halo might sit becomingly on his mother's brow. And again, his mother had to be supreme, and for the sake of that supremacy, every disloyalty was permissible. The woman won this battle with Jessie, even in death. There's no suggestion from Chambers that the depiction of the relationship in the novel is anything other than an accurate representation of Lawrence's relationship with his own mother. And in this, he finds no fault at all. It's normal, even ideal as far as he is concerned. But of course, and here we come to the next point, this has a profound effect on the ability of the boys to relate to other women. Walter Morrell, the father, of course, is depicted as a monster. Certainly he has a temper and he occasionally becomes violent, but mostly it's bluster, and he's revealed as pretty ineffectual. But the cruelty of the sons, particularly William and Paul, towards women is of another kind altogether and on another level. Let's start with William, the older brother. He dates a young woman called Lily. Now, as far as I can see, Lily is just an ordinary young woman who likes the things that a young woman liked in the last decade of the 19th century or thereabouts. Perhaps she's a bit frivolous and shallow, as women were expected to be at the time, but William and the family are unrelentingly vicious towards her, as if William is some deep, thoughtful, spiritual person who deserves better, when in fact he is frivolous, shallow, and thoroughly materialistic. And cruel. When Lily visits the Morrell household, she does behave a little uppity towards them, that's true. I would say, though, that it's not intended maliciously. She's unconsciously thoughtless. Let's grant that. William, though, on the other hand, is outwardly and explicitly and expressly cruel to her, while loving her. One evening, while William is writing a letter, the mother hands Lily a book that she's been reading. But the girl says she'd rather just sit and be still for a time. Let me read this exchange to you from the book. It's a little bit long, but bear with me. William scribbled irritably at a great rate. As he sealed the envelope, he said, "Read a book? Why, she never read a book in her life." "Oh, go along," says Mrs. Morrell, cross with the exaggeration. "It's true, mother. She hasn't," he cried, jumping up and taking his old position on the hearthrug. "She's never read a book in her life." "As like me," chimed in Morrell. "Canna see what there is i' books to sit boring your nose in 'em for. Nor more can I." "But you shouldn't say these things," said Mrs. Morrell to her son. At least she does come to Lily's defence a little bit here, even though she doesn't actually contradict him. She just says he shouldn't say it. "But it's true, mother. She can't read. What did you give her?" "Well, I gave her a little thing of Annie Swan's. Nobody wants to read dry stuff on a Sunday afternoon." "Well, I bet she hasn't read 10 lines of it." "You are mistaken," said his mother. All the time, Lily sat miserably on the sofa. Time and time again, William publicly humiliates her. He is completely contemptuous of her, yet somehow we're expected to believe he loves her. Subsequently, William becomes ill and dies. During his illness, William says to his mother, "And yet, you know, mother, for all that, if I died, she'd be broken-hearted for 2 months, and then she'd start to forget me. You'd see, she'd never come home here to look at my grave, not even once." And later Lawrence writes, "William had been a prophet. Mrs. Morrell had a little present and a letter from Lily at Christmas. Mrs. Morrell's sister had a letter at the New Year. I was at a ball last night. Some delighted people were there, and I enjoyed myself thoroughly," said the letter. "I had every dance, did not sit one out." Mrs. Morrell never heard any more of her. Okay, perhaps that's a little tactless, but did they really expect this young woman to throw herself on the funeral pyre? Did they expect her to worship this pig of a man after he treated her the way he did? Well, I guess they did, yes. After all, Mrs. Morrell's sons are divine. And this cruelty is not just that of the characters in the novel. It's not just the other characters that are cruel to Lily. As far as the author is concerned, Lily is a fribble, which apparently is a foolish or frivolous person, a thing of no importance. Because you see, William and Paul, and by extension Lawrence himself, are people of such superior spiritual, intellectual and moral quality. Clearly. Why else would William spend years courting a fribble? Why else would he spend years tormenting and gaslighting a mere fribble? And now we come to Paul and Miriam, Paul's childhood friend, confidant and lover. Miriam is clearly represented as someone of much better quality than Lily, although she's a mere farm girl, or maybe because she's a mere farm girl. Nevertheless, Paul's behaviour towards her is appalling. It's not just what he says to and about her, but also what he thinks about her, the way he thinks about her. Paul is drawn to the whole Levers family, especially the mother, one of the sons, Edgar, and Miriam. Lawrence writes, "To Miriam he more or less condescended because she seemed so humble." Their relationship grows over time, kind of, and eventually it becomes a sexual relationship. They become lovers of a kind. Lawrence has this somewhat ridiculous way of writing about Paul's emotions. He always either loves someone or something, or hates someone or something, often in the same breath. There are only these extremes. Jessie Chambers herself wrote sometime later on, "I never took his assertions about people and things seriously. They were not necessarily true, but they showed the inclination of his mood." And that is Paul, and I guess Lawrence. He is controlled by his moods, and he projects these inner moods, which are inwardly generated, onto the people around him and the situations in which he finds himself. The fault can't be with him, so when he feels bad, it must be because someone else has done something to annoy or irritate him, forcing him to hate them. He finds almost everything Miriam does irritating. When she bent and breathed the flower, it was as if she and the flower were loving each other. Paul hated her for it. There it is. There seemed to be a sort of exposure about the action, something too intimate. This from the pantheist, the nature lover who wrote the poem Green. The dawn was apple green, the sky was green wine held up in the sun, the moon was a golden petal between. She opened her eyes, and green they shone, clear like flowers undone, for the first time, now for the first time seen. And this from Paul Morell, who feels an intimate connection with the natural world and begins to make a living by painting it. Is he jealous of Miriam's attention, even to the flowers? Who can tell? Lawrence makes a great deal of Miriam's spiritual nature, as if it were a fault. Paul accuses her of trying to make him spiritual. "I don't want to be spiritual," he says. Of course, this is precisely what his mother tried to do to his father. And once again, the irony seems to be completely lost on Lawrence. So, Paul loves and despises Miriam. She has such pitiful, resigned arms, he thinks, whereas Clara, the other lover in the story, had very handsome, strong arms. There's one scene when Paul and Miriam are parting after spending time together. Looking around, he saw the pale blotch of her face down in the darkness under the hanging tree. There was no more of her but this pale blotch. Lawrence is a poet. He's a master of words. He could have chosen any words and phrases here, but he chose to describe the woman to whom he was probably closer than any other woman in the world, apart from the mother, of course. He chooses to describe her in this cold, cruel way as a pale blotch. Of course, Lawrence puts into Paul's mind all kinds of thoughts. They are, after all, his own thoughts. But he also places a lot of thoughts in Miriam's mind, which is perhaps a bit more problematic. I can't possibly go into all of that here, but there is one line of thought that he returns to again and again. The idea that Miriam sees giving herself to him sexually as some kind of painful sacrifice. The thought of their possibly having a physical relationship, the possibility that she might actually be attracted to him in this way, is a kind of serpent in the garden for Miriam. As far as Lawrence is concerned, Miriam is far too pure, far too spiritual. He wrote a letter to her towards the end of the book in which he says, "May I speak of our old worn love this last time? It too is changing, is it not? You see, I can give you a spirit love. I have given it to you this long, long time, but not embedded passion. See, you are a nun. I have given you what I would give a holy nun, as a mystic monk to a mystic nun. Surely you esteem it best. Yet you regret, no, have regretted the other. In all our relations, no body enters." Let's be clear, this is pure projection on the part of Paul Morell, and he's deluding himself if he thinks he gave her spirit love. He gave her no kind of love at all. And it's a projection on the part of Lawrence too. Lawrence wrote just such a letter to Jessie on her 21st birthday. When I look at you, what I see is not the kissable and embraceable part of you, although it is so fine to look at, with the silken toss of hair curling over your ears. What I see is the deep spirit within. That I love and can go on loving all my life. Look, you are a nun. I give you what I would give a holy nun. So you must let me marry a woman I can kiss and embrace and make the mother of my children. In response to this, Jessie writes in her memoir, I had no desire to be a nun. My instinct was to achieve some measure of understanding of life, not to evade it. Neither could I believe in his division of love into the physical and the spiritual. It seemed to me entirely mistaken. Lawrence is projecting his own thoughts and feelings onto Jessie, just as Paul projects his feelings onto Miriam. They're in Paul's imagination, they're in Lawrence's imagination. When Jessie read the earlier drafts of the novel, which Lawrence sent to her in bits and pieces as he wrote it, she was absolutely appalled by his description of her. She became convinced, in fact, that he never understood her in the slightest and that their entire relationship had been a lie. Shortly after the novel's publication, she broke off all contact with him. Which of these is the most reliable narrator, Jessie Chambers or Lawrence? Who can say? What I can say, I think, is that Lawrence, as he's writing, seems to have very little insight into how cruel Paul's and William's treatment is of the women they supposedly love and simultaneously hate. He's less cruel to Clara Dawes, the other woman in the story, the other lover. She's a woman 5 years his senior who is estranged from her husband. But she's also not a direct portrait of any single real person, the way Miriam is. She's more of a fictional character, a hybrid of several people. Let's just take a moment, though, to contrast Paul's attitude towards Miriam with his attitude towards Miriam's mother, Mrs. Levers. Paul fell under Mrs. Levers' spell. Everything had a religious and intensified meaning when he was with her. His soul, hurt, highly developed, sought her as if for nourishment. Together they seemed to sift the vital fact from an experience. Does Lawrence have any sense of the contradiction here? What he admires in the mother is precisely what he despises in the daughter, or at least what he imagines to be in the daughter's heart and soul. I suppose Paul is, as he says in his letter to Miriam, seeking the physical pleasure, which he finds to some extent with Clara. He assumes that this is not what Miriam wants, just as Lawrence assumes that it's not what Jessie wanted. I think he was probably wrong. In real life, shortly before the book was published, he hooked up in Europe with Frieda, the daughter of Baron Friedrich Ernst Emil Ludwig von Richthofen, who was married at the time to a British philologist and professor of modern languages, Ernest Weekly. She would be that woman I can kiss and embrace and make the mother of my children that Lawrence refers to in his letter to Jessie. She was 6 years his senior, like Clara in the novel. She's clearly partly inspired by Frieda. And she was already the mother of 3 children. She had to leave them behind with the father when she became divorced and married Lawrence. That's okay, though. She had Bert now. Perhaps she was mother enough to fill the void in his life after the death of his own mother. Well, that went somewhere, didn't it? Please bear in mind that this is not an academic treatise. It's purely my personal response to the book at this time in my life on this umpteenth reading of it. These were the things that jumped out at me in the course of this reading. Clearly, my understanding of the book and my response to the book has changed considerably over the years. I'd always had a kind of love-hate relationship with Paul Morell, much like he had with everyone else around him, really. But I think that's firmly resolved itself into hate at this stage. He's a despicable creature. And I don't think Lawrence really realizes that, nor does he realize how absolutely dreadful his mother is. He has no conception of how cruel he is being to the women around him, just as William before him didn't. Well, reading the book this time has piqued my interest somewhat in wanting to visit some of his later novels, particularly The Rainbow and Women in Love. How does his treatment of Ursula and Gudrun in those books, how does it compare with his treatment, especially of Miriam in Sons and Lovers? Does he treat them better than he treats Miriam? Maybe I'll go back and take a look, but that can be a story for another day. My plan for the next video, for episode 3, is to discuss Dune. That may change, but at the moment that's my plan. So see you next time.